Hi, Elaine here from markergeek.com. Today I've got a Copic colouring video for you. I realised recently that I had yet to do a video for one of the older tiny Townies from Stamping Bella, Heidi Needs a Hug. So I thought, since I love that image, I would colour it up for a project this week. I'm doing things a little bit differently. Today is just a colouring video. And you will be seeing the rest of my card project on Thursday for DT Thursday on the Stamping Bella blog. So yeah, I'm into the Copic colouring here. I have stamped my image. I stamped and masked Heidi Needs a Hug with the summer backdrop stamp inside a stitched circle die cut, just to give me a nice little framed scene. I stamped in extreme black ink from MFT on my favourite Copic colouring paper, Make It Colour Blending card. And I'm just colouring the background first. When I'm colouring something like this, I tend to like to start with the background first. One, because there's more chance of me making a horrendous mistake and feeling like I want to start over. And two, because if you do the background first, there's less chance of pulling strong colours from the image into the background and causing weird blobby colouring issues. And also it sort of just works nicely, working from sort of back to front. That way I can get all the background established without having to worry about fixing problems with my image. If I go into the image with some of the background colours, I can fix that with the colourless blender really easily. I'd recommend when colouring a scene like this, where you've got a character that you want to be sitting in the foreground and you've got a backdrop that you want to give the impression of distance, that you use a variety of different greens, keeping the stronger, brighter greens to the foreground, and then working backwards to some light, sort of less saturated greens. I've used, the lightest green that I used was G40. Also using sort of bluer tone, sort of cooler greens for the very distant objects. Works well. As you can see, I'm just building up in layers and creating some shadows underneath the character, and then just blending out those colours. When working on a hilly background like this, I tend to try and keep my marker strokes going with the shape of the hills. That allows you to get some nice blending and avoids having like weird straight lines, etc. For the sky, I'll just mention that I used two Copic colours, as you would have seen, and I just used a messy, scribbly style. Skies aren't my favourite things to colour. There are various ways that you could do it. I tend to, for an image like this where I'm keeping the sky really simple, I just prefer to use like the scribbly sort of messy technique that tends to blend fairly well as you're working quickly, but if it doesn't blend perfectly, you don't end up with weird lines and streaks. It all looks fairly sort of natural. Now working on the trees, I just used a current favourite combination of greens for this, and I used B06 to do the shading, to add in some shadow areas. Using blues to create shadows in greens works really well. Helps to desaturate the colour in some areas and gives a nice variation in tone. And when I finished working on the trees, I didn't do too much detail work with the trees, simply because they're supposed to be kind of in the background, and all the detail really wants to be in the image. I didn't want a tree that's meant to be on the top of a hill in the distance, sort of fighting with my image. Now I'm using a colourless blender, as you can see, as I mentioned, just to tidy up where the green from the grass has gone over onto her shoes. It can be quite challenging to work in smaller areas around detailed images, trying to colour things like the grass. So this is why I find it easier to do it first, then colour my image, because I can go in like this and correct any issues with the colourless blender. This is another reason why I really love this particular paper for Copic colouring, because the colourless blender works really well on it. You will find that how well the colourless blender works does depend on your paper, because of the way that the inks work within the paper and in the fibres of the paper. So test your paper. I know that if you're in the US, Express It blending card works fairly similarly. I've never found Nina Solar White Classic Crust, I think it is. I've never found Nina to be one of my favourites. I used to use it a lot when I first started colouring with Copics, but I found that it doesn't allow me to layer as much as I like. And also the colourless blender doesn't seem to work quite as well as I'd like on that paper. But paper is very much a personal preference, so if that's the paper you like to work with and it works for you, that's great. Moving on, I'm colouring the skin at the moment, using my go-to combination for skin. Not much to say about that, except that I'm adding some, I tend to work, if you haven't watched me before, I tend to work by laying down some of my lightest shade to map out the area, sort of map out where the shading, where the shadow areas are going to be first. Then I go in with my darkest colour, which in this case was E04, and just added a small amount of that darkest colour around the areas where the shadows are going to be. So underneath her fringe, underneath the sleeve on her shirt, and then I blend out with the next colour. So say if I was using 3 colours, I would blend out with my mid-tone then, and then returning to the lightest colour. And then I kind of work back again in layers, adding a little bit more here and there until I'm happy with the result. I tend to try not to overwork the skin, as you do end up with the earth tones, end up getting quite a lot of blotchiness. So I tend to work I tend to work with quite a few layers, but yeah, I tend to try not to overwork it, especially going back over with the lightest colour, with the E000 in this case, because that will cause quite a lot of splotchiness as it pushes some of those darker colours back. Once I'm done with the skin, I'm going to move on to the hair. I didn't get too detailed with the hair. I did try to, I love colouring hair. Hair is one of my favourite things to colour, and I know that isn't the case for everyone. With these small spaces, there is no need to try to get incredibly detailed. They can be tricky areas to get detail into, so it is a case of practicing, because you do need to have quite good marker control in order to get the fine flicks and the fine strokes that you need to build up the impression of hair texture. What I would say is, if you think a line has gone slightly wonky, or it isn't quite how you wanted it, just keep going and work with it. As you layer the colours, you will find that, and as you build up the colouring in the hair overall, you will find that those tiny little mistakes kind of soften out and aren't as noticeable and just become part of the texture of the hair. When you're creating your strokes, try to go with the shape of the hair. this usually, I try to keep my paper as still as possible when filming, and it isn't quite as necessary on smaller images, but it often works well for me to just keep turning the paper so that I can work my strokes in the way that works best for me. You may find that you are better at creating the fine strokes working away from yourself or working towards yourself. Practice and see what feels comfortable for you and how you get the best results. But don't be afraid to turn your paper in order to be able to get in the position that you need in order to get those strokes in. Again, I tried not to overwork the hair. I do get carried away sometimes. I do keep fussing and going back in and adding extra little details. But because it is such a small space, you can end up with problems with markers with the ink getting sticky, with oversaturating the paper. And really, you don't want to blend out all of that texture. So it's best to kind of keep your blending to a minimum, which is something that tends to be fairly difficult for me because I always want to kind of just go back in and just make things perfect. Moving on to the chicks, I'm using one of my favourite combos for colouring the chicks. It's just a really simple one, 2 shades of yellow and a earth tone, E11, just to add some shading. I also do sometimes like to use the blue violets to shade yellow. It can sometimes end up looking a little bit muddy, a little bit washed out. So I found that I really enjoy using this this particular combination. It gives quite a nice warm look. And again, with the chick, there's no need to fuss too much. You don't have to fuss as much as I do. I did just add some sort of texture to the wings and some shadows. But really, it doesn't have to be too complicated. And same again for the other chick. I do love colouring the chicks. I've coloured so many now that it's pretty much second nature. You could, of course, easily colour them to be a different type of bird. They work quite well in all sorts of different colours. One of the other Stamping Bella design team members and my friend Faye Wynne-Jones has done some really fun things with some of the chick stamps, turning them into robins and other birds. I think she did penguins with one of the images recently. So yeah, just be creative and do what works for you. I just went with chicks in this image. Moving on to the flower in her hair, I just used the colourless blender to tidy up a little bit. One note on working with the colourless blender, especially in such a small area, is that you want to kind of dab at the area where you want the ink, where you want to move the ink away from, where you want to remove it. It doesn't really remove the ink, it just kind of pushes it back, it pushes it around in the fibres of the paper. So what you want to do is bear that in mind and don't oversaturate the area, because you will end up causing the ink to feather into other adjoining areas. So really you just want to kind of dab it a little bit, let it do its work, and then see if you need to go back and do a little bit more. But don't just soak the area, because you will end up with a bit of a mess, especially on an area like this flower where I wanted to leave it white and the surrounding colour was quite strong. It's earth tones, it's browns, so that could have ended up in quite a mess if I'd have oversaturated that area. I just chose a really simple blue combination for her top and shoes. I tend to try and keep the number of colours I'm using in an image to a minimum. to avoid things looking too chaotic. So I knew that I was going to use paper that has quite a lot of pink in it. So I wanted to have like a pinky colour here. So I thought I would just use the blue to coordinate with that. I left the flowers on her shirt uncoloured so that they would just look sort of part of the pattern of the shirt, just an outline pattern. I didn't want to get too detailed there. And now I'm moving on to her dungarees. As I said, I went with a pink combination. I quite liked how this combination turned out. I used RV91 as the lightest shade, RV63, RV34, and then for the shadow areas, I used BG96 and BG93. And this is because I wanted to create desaturated shadow areas. I didn't want to just create a stronger pink. I wanted there to be a sense of a variation in tone, not just a variation in the strength of the colour. If you only create shadow areas with a stronger version, a stronger tone of the colour that you want the object to be, you are just creating a variation of the colour. You're not really creating shadows as such. Shadows don't tend to be, they tend to be desaturated, they tend to be a different tone. So in order to achieve that, you need to use a marker that's going to create that desaturated look in those areas. It's going to tone down. It's going to give you a darker area, but a toned down area. Hopefully that makes sense. When colouring the legs of her trousers here, I started out wanting to create some folds, because as you can see on the image, there are the indications for some creases and some folds. I ended up working over the area a couple of times because the creases on the side that are sort of coming in horizontally, those ended up being a little bit strong for me to start off with. They looked a bit unnatural, they looked a little bit too defined. So I ended up going over with the lighter shades a few times just to soften that out. So it was the impression of a bit of creasing, but not a strongly defined fold, because it really didn't work well with the more strongly defined sort of fold that was going on vertically. And yeah, I think that's pretty much it. As I said, if you would like to see the project that this coloured image ends up on, I will be posting that on Thursday for DT Thursday on the Stamping Bella blog, also on my own blog. I will come back and put the link to those posts in the description here on Thursday so that you can follow on if you are only just joining me. In the meantime, thank you for joining me today. I hope you've enjoyed the video and found it useful. I hope I've made sense. If you have enjoyed the video, please do like and subscribe. If you've got any questions, leave me a comment and I will try to answer them as best as I can. And I will see you next time.